problems that could help both the teacher and the student to go from closed to open-ended kinds of problems. So I'll give you some examples, and I'm going to take the math assessment that we designed for Discover, which I forgot to talk about in my session yesterday, and also because it's the easiest to see. So this problem type 1, for example, has the problem known, the method known, and the solution is known to the person who presents the problem, but not to the problem solver. So the only thing the problem solver has to do is find the right answer, according to the person who designed the test or the teacher who's giving that as the problem. So in math, 4 plus 7 equals 11. Method is given, the child finds the right answer. The second type has a method that's not specified. So, for example, from math, we use magic squares. And so the kids have to use this sign and say 10 minus 7 equals whatever. And we don't tell them about the fact that this is the magic part of the square, so that the answer is the same across and down. The third type of problem has a range of methods, but it still has one right answer. So an example would be a word problem. This is a word problem that could be solved through either subtraction or addition, but it still has one right answer. The fourth type of problem gets into that more open-endedness. So as you see, there's a gradual progression there from closed to open. So in the type 4, you have a range of methods and a range of solutions, so more than one of each. So in math, our example is to give the students 3 different numbers and to tell them to write correct or true addition or subtraction problems. So they have 2 different methods and they have 4 possible solutions. So again, there's some that are wrong, so that's why there's a range. The next one is actually one of my favorite problem types because it fits with curricula in the sense that you as the teacher can determine what kind of problem you want the children to solve, but they have complete freedom in deciding what methods to use and what solutions to come up with. And here's our example from math at K2. Write as many problems as possible that have 10 as the answer. You can use any number. And the fact is, you have an infinite number of methods and you have an infinite number of possible solutions. But the problem is well defined. So if you just think about also this problem versus the problem type 1, so if we just go back to this, for example, if you present this as an assessment item to a child, all you learn about that child is whether they know how to add 4 plus 7. But if you give them a problem like this, you learn, do they know how to add and subtract? Do they know how to multiply and divide? Do they know how to use numbers with 3 digits? You also learn something else that's very interesting that's illustrated in this particular example. You learn if that child thinks logically. So if you look at what she's done, 1 plus 9, 2 plus 8, 3 plus 7, so she has a very logical way of generating her solutions. So to me, that's a really important problem type for us to include. The last one is when the person has to define the problem before solving it. So in the math example, if you ask them to choose a number or an operation or a math idea and show it in as many ways as you can, that would be, again, the most open-ended. You could also say, show it in your own way. That would still be that problem type 6. So it doesn't have to be divergent. It can just be unique and the decision made by the child. Okay, so that's really been the a major focus of a lot of what we've done. We also realized that at some point, going back to my early work, which I think a lot of people in here have seen the books that I wrote on differentiating curriculum for the gifted, in which I listed content, process, product, and learning environment principles for differentiating the curriculum. I also talked about teaching models and which teaching models we could combine so that they met all of those differentiation principles. Well, through our work, we realized that what we were doing with the Discover curriculum was we really weren't quite addressing all of those principles. So we started experimenting with different approaches and different models that we might combine. So we developed what we're calling the real engagement in active problem-solving model, which as an approach addresses all of those differentiation principles. We combine Discover with the problem types and the multiple abilities with thinking actively in a social context, which is a problem-solving model that was developed by Belle Wallace. She's in the UK, but she developed it working with the Zulu people in South Africa. We've also combined it with problem-based learning. And I'd just like to acknowledge here how much I learned from my students. Sheila Gallagher's work on problem-based learning was very influential to me in adding problem-based learning to our approach, because it offers something that the other models don't. So here, what I'm also trying to show with this diagram is that these three models were combined because they all have in common problem solving. But they also offer things that the other doesn't offer. So in other words, the weaknesses in one are compensated for by the strengths in another one of the models. Another aspect of this model that we think is really important and seems to be a key to its success is that it's based on the regular curriculum. So it's not something that requires a total change in the existing curriculum, because we have our state and national standards that teachers need to follow. So REAPS is a model that you can do a little bit or a lot, again, based on what you already need to teach. So I'd like to give you some examples of the REAPS model in use. We started, excuse me, we started in 2004 with an institute for Korean teachers in math and science. And we started out with working with older students and teachers, and then we started moving it down because problem-based learning had been used at that time, had been used a lot with older students, but not with younger ones. So we started with high school and staff development, and then we moved to middle school, then we moved to upper elementary, and then we moved down to grade 3. Now we're working at grades 1 through 6. So just the idea of how does this model need to be adapted so that it's appropriate for all of these age levels and grade levels. And those of you who know me know that I really don't just work at the theoretical level. I have to get in there in the classroom. I have to get in there and watch the kids. I have to play with them. Some of my greatest joy is to have a kid come up to me and hug me and say, thank you for what you've done. But the other aspect of it is that I want my work to be useful to as many people as possible. And the other aspect that we're trying to incorporate into this is now taking it to several different countries to adapt it to the cultural context of those different countries, because the context is different. The regular curriculum is different, the classrooms are different, and the culture is different. So what we're doing here, and I'm going to go back first to discover. One of the things that many people think of when they see this problem continuum is they think we need to start with a type 1 problem and then go to a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 5 and a 6. Well, that's not necessarily the best way to do it. In fact, what we've discovered is that actually the best way to do it for us is to start with a problem type 5 and then to embed the other problem solving within the solving of that more complex problem, because that's more engaging to the students and it's more like real life. So I want to give you some examples of how we've been doing that with, again, the integration of problem-based learning. So I'll go back to that. Okay, I'm going to go back to this and start with the example from grade 3. So one of the things that we did with our grade 3 kids was we asked them, it's a unit on water, which they use the TASC kits, let's see, I can't remember what FOSS stands for, but it was a science curriculum that was developed at Stanford University through a National Science Foundation grant. And they've developed it over a long period of time. It's really a wonderful curriculum. So they were doing the water unit. And we wanted to do a project that would integrate and that would present them a big problem that they could work on and learn about water in that process. So water is important in Arizona because we have too little of it. So the idea was to build a water park that conserves water and uses earth materials. And that was this particular project. That's what we did one year. Another year, what we did was to build a water conservation collection device for the school. So this is an example of that. Here's a drawing of the school. We put the students in teams, and the students developed a conservation device for their section of the school. And then we would put that together as an overall school model. So the kids are developing models, which is, again, another aspect that we think is very important about this process. And that is that the students need to be actively engaged in the development of realistic models in which they can do hands-on, put their idea into practice. So put the idea that's in your head that you can see into something tangible. We also find that for students like, and we do have permission from this little boy, students like Eddie, who is on the autism spectrum, students like Eddie, who perhaps are not great at communicating at first, when he's working on a model, he can communicate. He's using his hands, he's offering his ideas. We had this boy in our classes for 2 years in working with the REAPS model. By the end of the second year, Eddie was presenting with his group, and he had a great sense of humor. So over a period of time, some things happen with kids that are really wonderful. Oh, yeah, great. Thank you so much. I thought I had some water up here, but I forgot it, so thank you so much. Okay, so that's a type 5. Now let's just go back and see what kind of other problems did we integrate into this particular process. So a type 1 was they did experiments with sinking and floating. They, in another project, they looked at ecosystems and they looked at their own models to see the accuracy of the details, because the whole idea of ecosystems is really important to understand how you might design a water conservation device. You have to understand the interdependence of the different elements of ecosystems. Another, a problem type 2, testing the surface tension of water and also compiling information from surveys. How do you actually compile information? That's a type 2. A 3, build a water strider that floats. So it's a type 3 because if you give them a lot of materials and then they learn about what a water strider is. It's a bug that can walk on the water because it spreads its legs, and it can walk on the water because of the surface tension of the water. Oops. Okay, let's see. A type 4, building a model of the water cycle would be a type 4. So that, again, that they understand that cycle of water. And the type 6, which actually comes out of that type 5, that problem-solving situation that you've given them. So a number of things the students might identify would be interviewing different groups at the school to see what kind of water collection devices they might accept. They really wanted to make a scale model of the school, design their water collection devices, and test them on the model before they actually built them on the school, which is a very good idea. And then find out what has been done at other schools. So to go back again then to this idea of growing out of their experiences. So if we get children involved in solving these open-ended kinds of problems, they can more easily get their own problems to come out of those and identify things that might be of further interest to them. Okay, I'd like to go back now to to the model. Okay, so that's the discover part of the REAPS model. Then we have thinking actively in a social context, which offers the process for solving the problem. So if we present them that type 5 problem, and they go through a structured process. I know a lot of people use creative problem solving, CPS, and future problem solving. We decided not to use CPS because of a number of features of thinking actively in a social context, the TASC model. One of the reasons is that it's conceived of as a circle. So it's not linear in that sense. Now we do, when we first introduce kids, we do take them through this process in which they go through those steps. But then after they've learned it, they recognize that sometimes after they've gathered and organized, they try to implement, and maybe that's not the approach that's appropriate. Maybe they have to go back and identify, what do we really want to do? Or when they get into the implement phase, they realize they need to go back and gather and organize more information. So I'm going to just basically go through those steps and with some examples. The examples here that you see with children, that's a recent program that my doctoral student Abdul Nasser did in Mexico. And I'll just tell you some of the things they did. First thing, they walked around their community and they looked at what kind of trash they saw around their community. And then they identified, what do we want to do that's related to this trash? How will we define our problem to solve? And then they generate ideas. This is that brainstorming step where they come up with as many ideas as possible. In this case, the students also watched a movie called Bag It, which is a really great movie about the proliferation of plastic and what happens to plastic. They develop criteria and decide which is the best idea to implement, and then they do it. Some other examples here are from a Korean Teachers Institute, which was the first time we did this model. Here are the students in Mexico, and they're designing posters in which they're showing their final results. Some of the students went around and collected plastic. Some of them went to the stores and asked how many plastic bags they distributed in a day. It was really fascinating what they found. So basically, this is a step in which they actually do what they have decided was the best solution. Next, they evaluate how well did we do it, and then they communicate their results. We believe that that's a really important part of the process for children, is to present to a real audience. And this also goes back to Joe Renzulli's model, the triad, the enrichment triad, in which the students present to a real audience. These are the students in Mexico. They're presenting to their families and to their community members. One other example of this kind of problem solving was with two grade 6 classes on the Navajo Nation. One of the things that happened with these children is that the teacher asked them to identify what were some of the most important problems in their communities that they wanted to solve. The students in 2 classrooms identified alcoholism as the problem they wanted to solve. So they worked on their solutions. They came up with solutions. They presented them to their families, which included grandmothers, grandfathers, children, and law enforcement officers. They had a number of people in their audience. And it's been very interesting to me that sometimes lawmakers, policymakers will listen to children when they won't listen to adults. Because, you know, they're our adults of the future, too. And the world we're creating is the world they're going to live in. So we have to listen to them. So this communicate step is really important for their self-confidence, but also for getting their messages out to a wider audience. The last step in TASC is to learn from experience and to say, what have I learned through this process? To reflect on that learning and to say, okay, here's where I want to go from here. Okay, so, oops, wow. Okay, we weren't supposed to go there. We were supposed to go here. Just a little bit about problem-based learning. I think most of you are familiar with problem-based learning, but I'll just go through a few aspects of it. The problem contains substantive content, it's ill-structured, and it mirrors real-world problems. So that's the aspect that problem-based learning brings into this model, the real-world nature of the problems. It also brings into it, I'll just quickly do this one so that you have another example. There's a river in Arizona that starts here, goes into Mexico, and comes back out. Here's what it looks like when it's at its origin. This is what it looks like after it comes out of a water treatment plant with all the effluent. And then when it gets to Tucson, it looks like this with no water at all. So we proposed that there was going to be a housing development project here, and should that happen? So another aspect of problem-based learning is that there are stakeholder groups. So people are in groups based on different perspectives on solving that problem. Again, that's something that comes from problem-based learning, but doesn't come from some of our other problem-solving situations. It makes it more real. It also makes it more possible or more likely that people will consider many perspectives in the solving of that problem. So here's an example using that Santa Cruz River problem. The development company, which would most likely be pro-development, the residents of the local area, which would most likely be con. They wouldn't really want it. Biodiversity group might not want it. Agriculture and mining, maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. And the Native American Tribal Council. These are all special interest groups that might have a stake in the solution to that problem. Okay, so again, that's the contribution of problem-based learning. So again, the three-part model with I fixed all these links. It's really interesting what happens when you, something worked. When you change from one version of PowerPoint to another version of PowerPoint, one would think that they would get better. Not necessarily. So the links that were fixed in one version might not be fixed in the next version. So anyway, and I fixed them all yesterday. Okay, so now what I'd like to do, it worked. Okay, now what I'd like to do is to just give you a little taste of the research that we've been doing on the REAPS model. And our implementation in different places. So our first study was, well, in most of these studies actually, we've used a model of participatory action research in which we're working with the teachers, the administrators, and the kids in designing the model. So we did it at a UK school. The teachers learned the model. They applied it in certain content areas. The teachers expanded their use of the TASC model to include multiple abilities, and then they designed ways to assess the students' strengths across those multiple abilities. Another thing they did was to do an audit of their own teaching to see how they implemented those different intelligences or abilities and the problem types. As you can see, as with many teachers, the problem types 5 and 6 were not as prominent as the problem types 1 and 2, and that certain abilities were not really part of their daily and monthly unit planning. So they then added to their curriculum and to their teaching some additional kinds of activities or experiences. Here are some examples of the activities they designed. They did a whole school profile of learning abilities. We concluded that the combined teaching models were very effective. The students enjoyed learning in these ways. Teachers felt more excited about teaching. And the teachers were motivated to continue expanding the kinds of opportunities they provided for children. One of the next actual studies we did, which was just recently, was taking this model to Saudi Arabia. And Nasser and Faisal worked with the teachers, and I was kind of the advisor of the project. So that was also a participatory action research combined with an experimental static comparison group design, which is basically, for those of you who don't like that lingo, it was a post-test of an experimental and a control group. So the teachers learned the model. They met weekly to discuss the implementation and to make adaptations. What we found is that the experimental group, this was using the test of creative thinking drawing production of Klaus Urbans. The students in the experimental group had a mean of 28.5, and the students in the control group had a mean of 17 on the test. So those results were significant at the .01 level. We also have the students' achievement scores. We haven't analyzed that part yet, or maybe we have, but it's not ready, quite ready for publication. A second thing that we're testing in this project is the students' content knowledge. In that process, we're experimenting with some new ways to assess children's content knowledge, because we find that multiple choice tests and the usual tests of content in which you have a defined problem type 1, problem type 2, that's not necessarily the best indication of gifted children's progress in understanding complex content. So we've been using concept maps, pre and post, on the content of the teaching unit. We really believe that those concept maps have been successful and are hoping to see the use of concept maps more and more in our field. Because in so many cases, people are saying that children who get into this gifted program have regressed in their knowledge because they're already at the ceiling of the test. And if they miss one more on the post-test than they did on the pre-test, it looks as if they've regressed when they really haven't. But we're finding that the concept maps really do show the students' progress. So here are two examples of the students' pre-test and their post-test. Even just by looking at the number of connections among ideas and the number of concepts they're able to use, you can see a difference in their complexity of content understanding. We have published one article about the use of concept maps, and now actually we may be getting a National Science Foundation grant to study the use of concept maps to identify giftedness in students. So it's a really interesting and very valuable method, we think, for understanding that the way students make connections among ideas, which is an aspect of creativity, but it's also an aspect of content understanding, and in fact, it's a very important way to see how closely children's thinking resembles the thinking of experts in the field. Because we know that experts have this complex knowledge base that's connected, that's interconnected. So that's the content research that we've been doing. Another is, as I said, we're collaborating with the kids. We interview the students after these experiences, like at the end of the school year, and we ask them, how is this science class different from the other science classes you've had? How important is it? And if you were the teacher, what would you do? So we have an article that's in progress. Well, actually, it's been submitted to the Gifted Child Quarterly about the students' perceptions. I'd just like to call your attention to that middle comment. This year we had a harder experience building models, which I really like, but it's hard. So I used hard twice there. But I really like. You have to make an idea, choose which idea you're making, do the idea, and then you have to write what you learn. So they see, and to me this is really important, they see the difficulty and the liking going together. Kids don't just like to do things that are easy. They want to have those challenges. So we're finding that that, in fact, is an element of this process. Another is the teacher perceptions. So we find that the teachers, and this is in the Saudi Arabia project, the teachers saw many benefits from using this model, and they believed that they could implement it successfully in their classrooms. They preferred that they have smaller groups of children because it would be more effective when used with smaller groups. So that's a lot of research in a fairly short period of time. I'd like to end my talk by just taking you through one particular activity, and then I'll end with, to me, the most important aspect of this research is what comes from the kids. What do they actually do as a result of participating in this kind of teaching approach? You have to laugh, otherwise you might cry. Like, okay, why did it go there instead of where I wanted it to go? Okay, so we're going back here and here. Okay, so after we had worked with this group of students for a year, we realized that they were ready to do a totally open-ended experience. So we showed them the documentary film Bag It, We discussed what are some of the causes of that use of plastic or the proliferation of plastic. We discussed the effects. And by the way, we used Hilda Taba teaching strategies. And I'd just like to say one thing here too, is that Sheila Gallagher has written a really great book on concept development, which is one of the Hilda Taba strategies. The Taba strategies are really great to add to any kind of teaching approach. That's what we used a lot as well with this model. And it might end up being one of the models that we might end up having a 4-part model. But we use Taba a lot, but it's difficult for a lot of teachers, so we haven't incorporated it totally. So the students discussed what individuals can do to help resolve the problem. They developed a written plan or a diagram of what they wanted to do, and they presented it to our group so that we could have discussions with the kids. Here's a child who, for example, decided he was going to reduce the use of plastic in his family. So he did things like putting cloth bags in the car so that they could never say they got to a grocery store and they didn't have a bag that wasn't plastic. And he had a number of techniques that he was going to use with his family. So again, conceiving of the problem in a way that he could actually solve it and he could see some effects of his solution. Another group collected plastic. They collected plastic from recycling bins and they collected plastic from just trash to see how much people threw away and how much they really recycled. So the whole classroom was full of plastic. But it was really very interesting, the volume they collected in just a week. Another little girl, and this one's really great, she developed a pledge for the rest of the students. I pledge to reduce my use of plastic. And so here the kids taking the pledge, and then she gave them a sticker if they took the pledge. Here's another group that developed a poster and they put it around their school. They then presented their results. One more that I didn't talk about, I'll just talk about here. This is, he went to Target, Walmart, and Safeway and asked them how many plastic bags they handed out per day. And then he multiplied that by 352. And then he multiplied it by the number of Target stores, Walmart stores, and Safeway stores in the city. And it seemed like it was 3.2 million bags a day. A year. A year that were given out. So they took their own approaches to solving this problem. And this one, I just have to talk about him. He developed a petition to take to the city council. And it says, we, the undersigned, believe that that single-use plastic bag should be banned for the world, but we choose to start locally by asking the city council to ban the distribution of single-use plastic bags in Tucson. So again, that approach of seeing how many people agreed with him. When I told him I was going to Dubai last summer, he said, oh, would you take my petition to Dubai? So I did, and I got 2 pages of signatures. I took it back to him. So that was really a fun kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to end my presentation by showing you a video that was made by 2 girls, Amelia and Emily, who are right here, who had never done a video in their lives. And I just thought it was really fascinating. They want it to be shown, and I told them I would show it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much for coming.